The wind cut through Willa Kane's threadbare coat like 1,000 knives as she stumbled through snow that reached past her knees, each breath burning her lungs with cold that felt sharp enough to slice her from the inside out. Behind her, somewhere in the white wall of the blizzard, Malcolm Voss would be looking for her, and she knew if he found her this time, she would not live to see another dawn. The bruises on her ribs still ached from 3 nights ago when she had dared to speak against him at supper, and the memory of his hand wrapped around her throat was enough to keep her legs moving even when her body screamed to collapse into the snow and simply let the cold take her. She had left Wallace, Idaho, in the dead of night on December 15, 1878, with nothing but the clothes on her back and $17 she had stolen from the tin box Malcolm kept hidden beneath the floorboards. Her mother had been dead for 2 years now, consumption taking her slowly while Malcolm stood by and did nothing but drink whiskey and curse the cost of the doctor. Willa had been 19 when her mother passed, and in the year and a half since, Malcolm had grown bolder in his cruelty, his fists quicker, his words more vicious. Last night he had come to her room with whiskey on his breath and something dark in his eyes that made her skin crawl, and she knew with absolute certainty that if she stayed one more day, she would lose more than her dignity, so she ran. The storm had blown in from the north just after midnight, and by the time she reached the trail leading out toward the mining camps, visibility had shrunk to mere feet. Willa knew she should have waited, should have found shelter, but the fear of Malcolm finding her before she could get far enough away drove her forward into the teeth of the blizzard. Now, hours later, she could no longer feel her feet, and her hands had gone from painful to numb to nothing at all. The world had become nothing but white and cold, and the sound of wind howling through the pines like the voices of the damned. She fell for the 3rd time and found she could not get up. Her arms would not hold her weight, and her legs simply refused to obey. Willa lay there in the snow, face pressed against the frozen ground, and thought about her mother. She thought about the songs her mother used to sing while hanging laundry, about the way she would braid Willa's hair every Sunday morning before church, about the smell of her lavender soap. At least she would not die at Malcolm's hands. At least she had that. The darkness came creeping in from the edges of her vision, and Willa closed her eyes. Graham Stone had been riding for 2 days straight, pushing his mare harder than he liked. But the silver he had earned from the mine in Mullen needed to reach the bank in Wallace before the roads became completely impassable. The blizzard had caught him by surprise, rolling in fast and mean, and he had been cursing his own stubbornry for not stopping in the last town, when he saw something dark against the snow just off the trail. At first he thought it was a fallen log or perhaps a deer that had frozen during the night, but as he drew closer, his heart seized in his chest. A woman lay crumpled in the snow like a discarded doll, her dark hair spread around her head in a tangle of ice crystals. Graham was off his horse before he had fully registered what he was doing, dropping to his knees beside her and pulling off his glove to press his fingers against her throat. The pulse was there, faint and slow but present. She was alive. He did not waste time trying to wake her. Graham gathered her into his arms, shocked at how light she was, how cold her body felt even through her coat. He could see the blue tinge to her lips, the way ice had formed on her eyelashes. She needed warmth, and she needed it now, or she would be dead within the hour. There was a lined shack about a mile back, a small shelter the miners used when they needed to wait out storms. Graham had passed it 20 minutes ago. He carried the woman to his horse, which danced nervously at the unfamiliar burden, and managed to get himself into the saddle with her cradled against his chest. Then he turned the mare around and urged her into a careful trot back the way they had come. The shack was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a stove and a small supply of wood stacked in the corner, and that was all that mattered. Graham kicked the door open and carried his burden inside, laying her carefully on the single cot while he worked to get a fire started. His hands shook as he struck the match, whether from cold or fear he could not say. But within minutes, he had flames crackling in the stove, blessed heat beginning to fill the small space. Only then did he turn his full attention to the woman. She was young, probably no more than 20 or 21, with a face that would have been pretty if not for the waxy pallor of near death and the purple bruise that colored her left cheekbone. Graham felt a flash of anger at that bruise but pushed it aside. First things first. He began removing her wet clothes, working quickly but carefully, trying to maintain what modesty he could while knowing that leaving her in frozen fabric would kill her as surely as the cold itself. Her coat came off first, then her dress, which had soaked through entirely. Beneath it she wore a thin chemise and drawers, both wet. Graham hesitated only a moment before removing those as well, then wrapped her in every dry blanket he could find in the shack, including his own bedroll. He built up the fire until the stove glowed red, and then he sat beside her and began rubbing her hands and feet, trying to coax life back into frozen limbs. For an hour he worked, stopping only to add wood to the fire or check her pulse. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, color began to return to her face. Her breathing deepened. Her fingers, which had been stiff and white, flushed pink. When her eyes finally opened, Graham felt relief crash through him with such force that he had to sit back on his heels. Willa's first conscious thought was that she had died and gone to hell, because surely only hell could hurt this much. Every part of her body screamed with pain, a burning, stabbing agony that made her want to scream. She tried to move and found herself wrapped so tightly in blankets she could barely shift. "Easy now," a man's voice said, low and calm. "You are safe. Just breathe." Willa's eyes focused slowly on the face above her. A man, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair and gray eyes that held genuine concern. He had a strong jaw and a straight nose, and there was a kindness in his expression that made something in her chest ache. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat raw. "Line shack about 3 miles outside Wallace. I found you on the trail. You were nearly frozen to death." He reached for something beside him and brought back a tin cup. "Here, water. Drink slowly." She tried to sit up and realized with horror that beneath the blankets she was naked. Her face must have shown her panic because the man immediately raised his hands and took a step back. "I had to get your wet clothes off. You would have died otherwise." "I did not." He stopped, his own face coloring slightly. "I only did what was necessary to save your life. Your clothes are drying by the fire. I will turn around while you check yourself if you need to be sure I am telling the truth." Something in his voice made her believe him. Willa looked past him to where her dress and undergarments hung on a line he had strung near the stove. She looked back at him, at the genuine distress in his eyes that she might think ill of him, and felt some of the tension leave her body. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me." His expression softened. "What is your name?" "Willa Kane." "Graham Stone." He nodded toward the cup. "Drink." "Then if you feel able, you can tell me why a woman was walking alone through a blizzard in the middle of winter." The water hurt going down, but it was a good hurt, a hurt that meant she was alive. Willa drank slowly, as instructed, and tried to organize her thoughts. This man had saved her life. He deserved the truth, or at least some version of it. "I was running away," she said finally, "from my stepfather. Malcolm Voss. He is not a good man." She saw Graham's eyes flick to the bruise on her face and his jaw tightened. "He hurt you." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. For the last year since my mother died, it has gotten worse. Last night I knew if I did not leave, something terrible would happen, so I ran. I did not know the storm would be so bad." Graham was quiet for a long moment, and Willa found herself studying him in return. He was handsome in a rugged way, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work and broad shoulders that strained against his wool shirt. But it was his eyes that held her attention, gray as the storm outside, but warm with something she had not seen in a man's eyes in a very long time: compassion. "You cannot go back," Graham said finally. "I know, I will not." "Do you have family anywhere, friends?" Willa shook her head. "My mother's people were back in Ohio, but I have not heard from them in years. There is no one." She saw something shift in Graham's expression, saw him make some kind of decision. "The storm is going to last at least through tonight, maybe longer. When it clears, I will take you wherever you want to go. But Willa Kane, if you have nowhere to go, I might have an option for you." "What kind of option?" "My ranch is about 15 miles south of Wallace. It is not much, just a small spread with about 50 head of cattle and some horses, but it is mine, paid for with silver I dug out of the mountain with my own 2 hands. I have been needing help around the place since my sister married and moved to Spokane last spring. The house has 2 bedrooms. You could stay there, help with the cooking and the chickens and such, and in return you would have a roof over your head and safety. It would be proper. I would not ask anything of you except honest work." Willa stared at him, barely able to process what she was hearing. "You do not know me. Why would you offer me such a thing?" Graham met her eyes steadily. "Because I know what it is like to run from something terrible. And because no woman should have to choose between abuse and freezing to death in a blizzard. You need help, and I am able to give it. That is reason enough." Tears burned in Willa's eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself in months. "I do not know what to say. Say you will think about it." "We have time. Storm is not going anywhere." Graham stood and moved to the stove, checking the fire. "Your clothes should be dry soon. Are you hungry?" As if in response to his question, Willa's stomach growled audibly. She could not remember the last time she had eaten a full meal. Graham smiled, the expression transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip. "I will take that as a yes. I have jerky and some beans. Not fancy, but it will fill your belly." As Graham prepared food, Willa lay wrapped in the blankets and let herself feel something she had not felt in 2 years. Hope. The storm raged for another day and a half, trapping Graham and Willa in the tiny lined shack with nothing to do but talk. At first their conversations were careful, polite, but as the hours wore on, they began to share more. Graham told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west after his parents died of fever when he was 17. He told her about the backbreaking work in the mines, about saving every penny for 3 years until he had enough to buy his land. He told her about his sister, Clara, who had been the only family he had left until she fell in love with a merchant and moved away. Willa, in turn, told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her father who had died when she was 12, about her mother who had tried so hard to give her a good life, but had made the mistake of marrying Malcolm Voss in a moment of desperation. She told him about watching her mother grow smaller and quieter under Malcolm's control, about the relief and guilt she had felt when consumption finally took her mother away from the misery her life had become. "I should have protected her," Willa said, staring at the flames in the stove. "I should have done something." "You were a child," Graham said firmly. "It was not your responsibility to save her, and you cannot let guilt over what you could not change destroy you. Believe me, I know. I spent 2 years hating myself for not being able to save my parents from the fever. All that hate did was make me bitter. It was not until I let it go that I was able to start building something worth having. Willa looked at him, at the firelight playing across his features, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. This man who barely knew her had risked his own safety to save her life, had offered her a home without asking anything in return, and now sat talking to her as if she were someone worthy of his time and respect. It was more than anyone had given her in years. "I want to accept your offer," she said quietly, "if it still stands." Graham's face broke into a smile that made him look younger, almost boyish. "It stands. I am glad, Willa, truly glad." On the morning of the third day, the storm finally broke. Graham ventured outside first, checking the depth of the snow and the condition of his horse, who had weathered the storm in a small lean-to attached to the shack. When he came back in, his cheeks were red with cold, but his expression was optimistic. "Snow is deep, but passable. If we take it slow, we can make it to my ranch by nightfall." Willa dressed carefully in her now dry clothes, hyper-aware of Graham's presence even though he kept his back turned, until she told him she was ready. Her body still ached, and her fingers and toes burned with the lingering effects of frostbite, but she was alive and free, and that was more than she had dared hope for 3 days ago. The ride south was cold but clear, the sky a brilliant blue that hurt to look at after days of gray. Graham kept his horse to a careful walk, mindful of the drifts, and Willa rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. She tried not to think about how solid he felt, how safe. The ranch appeared just as the sun was beginning to set. A small house with a barn and a few outbuildings nestled in a valley between 2 pine-covered hills. Smoke rose from the chimney, which confused Willa until Graham explained that he had hired a hand to look after the place while he was gone. The hand turned out to be a grizzled man in his 50s named Pete, who took one look at Willa and raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. Graham introduced her simply as a woman who would be helping around the house, and Pete nodded as if strange women appearing on his employer's horse was a common occurrence. The house was small but well built, with a main room that served as both kitchen and sitting area, and 2 bedrooms off to one side. It was clean and spare, clearly the home of a man who spent most of his time working, but it was warm and solid, and Willa felt herself relaxing for the first time in longer than she could remember. "That room is yours," Graham said, pointing to the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. "It is not much, but the bed is good and the door has a lock on the inside. I want you to feel safe here, Willa. That is the most important thing." The fact that he understood she might need a lock on her door, that he had thought of that without her having to ask, made Willa's eyes sting with tears again. "Thank you, Graham, for everything." He ducked his head, suddenly shy. "You do not need to keep thanking me. We will help each other." That is how it works. Over the next few weeks, Willa settled into life on the ranch with an ease that surprised her. She woke early to make breakfast for Graham and Pete, took care of the chickens and the vegetable garden, and spent her afternoons cooking and cleaning and mending. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and no one raised a hand to her or spoke cruel words. Graham was unfailingly kind, treating her with a respect she had almost forgotten was possible. Pete was gruff but good-natured, and he quickly developed a habit of leaving fresh game on the kitchen doorstep whenever he went hunting. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, Willa found herself looking forward to the evenings most of all. After supper, Pete would retire to the bunkhouse he shared with the 2 other hands Graham had hired for the winter feeding, and Graham and Willa would sit by the fire, talking or reading or simply enjoying the comfortable silence. Sometimes Graham would play his harmonica, simple melodies that spoke of loneliness and longing, and Willa would sit with her mending and let the music wash over her like a blessing. It was on one of these evenings, 3 weeks after her arrival, that Willa looked up from the shirt she was mending to find Graham watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What is it?" she asked. Graham shook his head, looking embarrassed. "Nothing. I was just thinking that the house feels different with you in it. Better, more like a home and less like just a place to sleep between work." Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I am glad I can help. It is more than that." Graham leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes serious. "Willa, I want you to know that you do not owe me anything. I did not bring you here expecting anything in return except what we agreed on. If you ever want to leave, if you ever feel uncomfortable, you just say the word and I will help you get wherever you want to go. I need you to know that." "I know," Willa said softly. "You have been nothing but honorable, Graham. I have never felt unsafe here." Something in his expression eased. "Good. That is good." But as Willa returned to her mending, she found her thoughts spinning. The truth was that she did not want to leave. For the first time in years, she felt like she had found a place where she belonged. And it was not just the house or the work that made her feel that way. It was Graham himself, with his quiet strength and his gentle hands and his gray eyes that looked at her like she was something precious. She was falling in love with him, she realized with a start, and the knowledge both terrified and exhilarated her. Christmas came and went, celebrated with a small feast that Willa prepared and presents exchanged by the fire. Graham gave her a beautiful woolen shawl he had bought in Wallace, deep blue and soft as a cloud. And Willa gave him a shirt she had sewn in secret, cut to fit his broad shoulders. The look on his face when he opened the package, the way his fingers traced the careful stitches, made her heart race. "This is the finest shirt I have ever owned," he said quietly. "Thank you, Willa." The snow began to melt in late February, revealing the brown grass beneath and the first brave shoots of spring growth. The work on the ranch increased as calving season approached, and Willa found herself seeing less of Graham during the day as he spent long hours checking on the herd and mending fences. But the evenings were still theirs, and as the days lengthened, so did their conversations. It was on a night in early March, with the windows cracked to let in the surprisingly warm breeze, that everything changed. They had been talking about Graham's plans for the ranch, about how he hoped to increase the herd and maybe build a larger barn in the fall when he suddenly fell silent, his expression troubled. "What is wrong?" Willa asked. Graham was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to be honest with me about how you feel after I say it, even if it means you want to leave." Willa's heart began to pound. "All right. I am in love with you, Willa." The words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back for so long that they could not be contained any longer. "I know I should not be. I know you came here to escape one man, and probably the last thing you want is another man making demands of you. But I cannot keep pretending I do not feel what I feel. You are the first thing I think of when I wake up and the last thing I think of before I sleep. You make me laugh. You make me want to be better. And I am terrified that by telling you this, I am going to drive you away, but I cannot lie to you anymore, even by omission." Willa could barely breathe. She stared at Graham, at the vulnerability in his eyes, at the way his hands trembled slightly where they gripped each other, and felt her own heart threatening to burst. "You are not driving me away," she whispered. "Graham, I love you too. I have been so afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I do. I love you." The expression on Graham's face was one of such pure joy that it made her want to cry. He stood and crossed to where she sat, dropping to his knees in front of her chair and taking her hands in his. "Say it again," he said hoarsely. "I love you, Graham Stone." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the violent, demanding kisses Malcolm had forced on her. This was gentle and sweet and full of such tenderness that Willa felt something inside her heal, some broken part she had thought would never be whole again. She kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into it, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "Marry me," Graham said. "I know it is fast. I know we should probably wait. But Willa, I do not want to wait. I want you to be my wife. I want to build a life with you, a real life. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to give you the home and the safety and the love you deserve. Please say yes." Willa felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were tears of happiness. "Yes, yes, Graham, I will marry you." They were married a week later in a simple ceremony in Wallace, with Pete and Clara and her husband as witnesses. Willa wore a new dress Graham had bought her, soft green calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and Graham wore the shirt she had made him for Christmas. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Graham kissed her, Willa felt like her life was finally, truly beginning. The first months of their marriage were a kind of heaven Willa had never imagined existed. Graham was patient and gentle, letting her set the pace of their physical intimacy, never pushing or demanding. He told her he loved her a dozen times a day, in words and in actions, in the way he held her at night, and in the way he looked at her across the breakfast table. Willa bloomed under his love like a flower finally given water after a long drought. The ranch prospered. That spring they added 20 more head of cattle, and Graham hired another hand to help with the increased work. Willa expanded the garden, adding herbs and vegetables, and she began selling eggs in town to bring in extra money. They talked about the future, about building onto the house and maybe buying the adjacent property when it came up for sale. They talked about children, about how many they wanted and what they would name them. In late May, Willa realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week to be sure, then told Graham over breakfast one morning, her heart in her throat. Graham's fork clattered to his plate. "Truly." "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor." He was around the table in an instant, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around the kitchen. "We are going to have a baby. Willa, we are going to be parents." His joy was infectious, and Willa found herself laughing, really laughing in a way she could not remember ever doing before. "Yes, we are. Are you happy?" "Happy." Graham set her down carefully as if she were made of glass and cupped her face in his hands. "I am the happiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Willa dealt with morning sickness for the first few months, but Graham was endlessly solicitous, bringing her tea and crackers in bed and taking over some of her chores when she was too tired to do them herself. As her belly grew, so did their excitement. They spent the long summer evenings building a cradle, Graham cutting and sanding the wood while Willa sewed tiny clothes and blankets. It was in August, when Willa was 6 months along, that Malcolm Voss finally found her. She had gone into Wallace to pick up supplies, accompanied by Pete as she always was when Graham could not go with her. They were loading the wagon outside the general store when a harsh voice cut through the afternoon air. "Willa." She froze, every muscle in her body going rigid. She knew that voice. It had haunted her nightmares for months. Malcolm stood across the street, looking older and meaner than she remembered, his face red with drink or anger or both. He started toward her, his stride purposeful, and Willa felt panic rise in her throat. Pete stepped in front of her, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. "That is close enough, friend." Malcolm's eyes flicked to Pete, then back to Willa. "That is my stepdaughter. She ran away and stole money from me. I have every right to take her home." I am not your stepdaughter anymore, Willa said, forcing her voice to stay steady. My mother is dead, which means you have no claim on me, and I am married now. My name is Willa Stone, and my husband is waiting for me at home. Something ugly twisted in Malcolm's expression. You think I am going to let some ranch hand steal what is mine? You owe me, girl. Years of putting a roof over your head and food in your mouth. You think you can just walk away from that debt? I owe you nothing, Willa said, and there was steel in her voice now. You were cruel to my mother and cruel to me. I would have died in that house if I had stayed. I do not owe you gratitude for not killing me, Malcolm. That is just basic human decency, and you could not even manage that much. A crowd was gathering now, townspeople stopping to watch the confrontation. Malcolm looked around, seemed to realize he was outnumbered, and his expression turned calculating. Fine, keep your new life. But I want the money you stole. $17. You give me that, and I will leave you alone. Willa felt Pete tense beside her, but she put a hand on his arm. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather purse, counted out $17 and held it out. Take it and go. I never want to see you again. Malcolm snatched the money from her hand, but before he could turn away, a new voice cut through the tension. You heard the lady. Take your money and get out of my town. Willa's heart leapt. Graham stood at the end of the street, his horse lathered as if he had ridden hard. He must have seen Malcolm in town and come as fast as he could. He walked toward them now, his stride long and purposeful, and there was something in his eyes that made even Malcolm take a step back. This is none of your business, ranch hand, Malcolm said, but his voice lacked conviction. It is every bit of my business. That is my wife you were threatening, and if I ever see you near her again, if I ever hear that you have so much as spoken her name, I will make sure you regret it. Do we understand each other? Graham was not a violent man by nature, but there was no mistaking the steel in his voice or the promise in his eyes. Malcolm looked between Graham and Willa, seemed to realize he had lost, and spat in the dust. She is not worth this much trouble anyway. You are welcome to her. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the saloon across the street. Willa let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and suddenly her legs would not support her. Graham was there in an instant, catching her before she could fall, holding her against his chest. I have you, he murmured into her hair. You are safe. He is gone. That night, lying in bed with Graham's arms around her and their baby moving beneath her hands, Willa finally felt the last chains of her past fall away. Malcolm could not hurt her anymore. She was free, truly free, and loved beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. Graham's arms tightened around her. For what? For saving me, for loving me, for giving me a life worth living. She felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. You saved yourself, Willa. You walked through a blizzard to find your freedom. I just had the good fortune to find you on the other side. Their son was born in February of 1879, a year almost to the day after Graham had found Willa in the snow. They named him James, after Graham's father, and he came into the world squalling and red-faced and perfect. Graham cried when the midwife placed the baby in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son for the first time. He is beautiful, Graham whispered. Willa, he is so beautiful. Willa, exhausted and sore but happier than she had ever been, smiled up at her husband. He looks like you. He has your eyes. Raising a baby on a ranch was hard work, but they managed. Willa learned to carry James in a sling while she worked in the garden, and Graham would take him out to the barn in the mornings, talking to him about the horses and the cattle as if the infant could understand every word. The hands were all half in love with the baby, taking turns holding him and making silly faces to make him smile. As James grew from infant to toddler, The ranch continued to prosper. Graham bought the adjacent property and expanded their herd. They added onto the house, building a larger kitchen and a proper room for James. Willa started teaching reading and writing to some of the children in town, bringing in extra money and finding joy in the work. Their life was full and rich and good. When James was 3, Willa found herself pregnant again. Their daughter, Rose, was born in the spring of 1882, and she was the image of her mother, with dark hair and green eyes and a stubborn streak a mile wide. Graham doted on both his children equally, but there was something special about watching this strong, capable man brought to his knees by a tiny girl who had him wrapped around her finger from the moment she was born. The years passed in a blur of work and laughter and love. James grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere, learning to ride and rope and care for the animals. Rose was wild and fearless, climbing trees and racing her brother and refusing to wear dresses unless absolutely forced. Willa and Graham watched their children grow with pride and wonder, still amazed sometimes that this was their life, that they had built something so beautiful from such difficult beginnings. On a spring evening in 1885, Willa stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains. James and Rose were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Graham came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Willa leaned back into his embrace, her hands covering his where they rested on her stomach. "I was thinking about how different my life could have been. If you had not found me that day, if you had not offered me a home, if I had not been brave enough to accept. You were always brave enough. That is one of the things I love most about you." Willa turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had saved her life and then made it worth living. His hair had a few threads of gray now, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting in the sun, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. More than that, he was good and kind and true, and she loved him more with each passing year. "I love you, Graham Stone." He smiled, the expression warm and tender and full of everything they had built together. "I love you too, Willa Stone, today and every day for the rest of my life." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Willa kissed her husband and felt gratitude wash through her like a benediction. She had walked through a blizzard to escape her past, and she had found not just safety on the other side, but love. Real, deep, abiding love that had given her a family and a home and a future she had never dared to dream of. The ranch continued to thrive as the years rolled on. By 1888, Graham and Willa owned nearly 300 acres and ran over 200 head of cattle. They had built a new barn and added another room to the house, this one a study where Graham kept his books and Willa could work on her teaching plans. James, now 9 years old, was already showing the makings of a fine rancher, with his father's steady hands and his mother's quick mind. Rose, at 6, was the heart of their home, full of joy and mischief in equal measure. Willa had never stopped teaching, and over the years her little lessons had grown into a proper school that met 3 days a week in the church building. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to 15 children ranging from ages 5 to 14, and she loved every minute of it. Graham was endlessly proud of her, bragging to anyone who would listen about his brilliant wife who could run a household, raise 2 children, and still find time to educate half the young people in the county. They made friends in Wallace and the surrounding area, good people who invited them to church socials and barn raisings and harvest celebrations. Clara and her husband visited every summer, bringing their own growing brood of children for James and Rose to play with. Pete retired from ranch work, but built himself a small cabin on the edge of their property, declaring he was too old to start over somewhere new, and besides, somebody had to keep an eye on them. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when they lost cattle to the cold, and dry summers when the grass turned brown and the creek ran low. There were scares when one of the children got sick, nights spent anxiously hovering over a feverish child and praying for the illness to break. There were disagreements, as any married couple has, about money or how to discipline the children or whether to expand the ranch further. But through it all, Graham and Willa faced everything together, their love the foundation upon which they built everything else. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Graham took Willa into Wallace for a proper celebration. They had dinner at the hotel restaurant, a rare luxury, and afterward Graham presented her with a gift wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Open it," he urged, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. Willa unwrapped the package carefully to find a leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with her initials. Inside, on the first page, Graham had written in his careful handwriting, "For the story of our life together, so we never forget how it began." Willa's eyes filled with tears. "Graham, this is beautiful. I thought you could write down our story, for the children so they know how we found each other, and for us so we can remember." That night, after they returned home and the children were asleep, Willa sat at the table with the journal open in front of her and began to write. She wrote about walking through the blizzard, about the fear and the cold and the certainty that she would die. She wrote about waking up in a lined shack with a stranger who had saved her life. She wrote about falling in love slowly, over evenings by the fire and days of honest work. She wrote about their wedding and their children and the life they had built together from nothing but hope and determination. Over the years, she added to the journal, recording birthdays and holidays and all the small moments that made up a life. James's first successful cattle drive, Rose learning to read, the summer Graham built a swing in the big oak tree behind the house, the winter Willa taught herself to make her mother's apple pie from memory. All of it went into the journal, a record of a love that had started with a desperate flight through a storm and had grown into something strong and lasting and true. When James was 15 and Rose was 12, another winter storm blew through Wallace, this one as fierce as the one that had brought Graham and Willa together all those years ago. They were all safe inside the house, the animals secured in the barn. But as Willa watched the snow swirl past the windows, she found herself remembering that night when she had been so young and so afraid, when she had run into a blizzard rather than face another day under Malcolm's roof. Graham came to stand beside her, following her gaze out into the storm. "What are you thinking?" "I was thinking about another storm a long time ago." He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "The one that brought you to me." "Yes." Willa leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was so scared that night. I thought I was going to die. And in a way, I suppose the person I was did die. But something better was born." "Not something better," Graham said softly. "You were always good, Willa. You just needed a place where you were safe enough to let yourself bloom." She turned to look at him, at this man who had seen her at her lowest and had chosen not just to save her, but to love her. "Do you remember what you said to me, after Malcolm confronted us in Wallace? You said I saved myself, that I walked through a blizzard to find my freedom, and you just had the good fortune to find me on the other side." "I remember. I have been thinking about that, about how we both had to be brave. I had to be brave enough to run, and you had to be brave enough to offer help to a stranger. And then we both had to be brave enough to let ourselves fall in love." Graham cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Best decision I ever made, loving you. Best decision I ever made, letting you." They stood there together as the storm raged outside, warm and safe and surrounded by the life they had built. From the other room came the sound of the children arguing over a board game, Rose's voice rising in indignation as James laughed. Normal sounds. Happy sounds. By 1892, James was 16 and already managing much of the day-to-day work on the ranch. He had his father's height and build, and his mother's green eyes, and he was turning into a fine young man. Graham had started teaching him the business side of ranching, how to negotiate with buyers and keep the books, preparing him for the day when the ranch would be his responsibility. Rose, at 13, had announced her intention to become a teacher like her mother. She was brilliant and stubborn and had a gift for explaining complicated ideas in simple ways. Willa had already started letting her help with the younger students, and it was clear she had a natural talent for the work. Willa herself was 33 now, and Graham was 36. They were in the prime of their lives, healthy and strong and deeply content. The ranch was successful enough that they could have hired more help and taken things easier, but neither of them wanted to. They loved the work, loved the rhythm of the seasons and the satisfaction of building something with their own hands. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Graham reached over and took Willa's hand. "Have I told you lately that you are the best thing that ever happened to me?" Willa laughed. "You told me this morning, actually, and yesterday, and the day before that." "Well, it is true." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "I cannot imagine my life without you." "Cannot even remember what it was like before." "Lonely," Willa said. "You told me once that the house felt more like a place to sleep between work than a home before I came. And you made it a home. You made me a home." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets sing and watching the light fade from the sky. Inside, they could hear James playing his guitar, a skill he had taught himself over the past year, and Rose singing along, her clear voice carrying through the open windows. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had gone differently?" Willa asked suddenly. "If I had died in that blizzard, if you had not found me," Graham was quiet for a moment before answering. "Sometimes, but not in a dwelling way, more like counting blessings. Every time I look at you, every time I hold one of our children, I think about how close I came to never having any of this. It makes me grateful for every single day." Willa squeezed his hand. "I feel the same. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night and have to remind myself that this is real, that I really did escape, that I really am loved and safe and happy." "It is real," Graham said firmly. "This is your life now, Willa, our life. And it is going to stay this way for as long as I have breath in my body." As the stars began to appear overhead, Willa thought about the journal Graham had given her on their 10th anniversary, now filled with years of memories and moments. She thought about everything they had survived and built and celebrated together. She thought about the girl who had run into a blizzard rather than accept the life that had been forced upon her, and the woman she had become in the safety of Graham's love. The years continued to unfold in their predictable, precious way. James fell in love with a girl from town, a sweet-natured young woman named Anna who helped her father at the general store. Graham and Willa gave their blessing, and in 1894 they held a wedding celebration on the ranch that brought together what felt like the entire county. Watching James exchange vows with his bride, Willa felt her heart swell with pride and joy, and when she looked over at Graham, she saw tears on his cheeks. "Our boy is all grown up," he whispered. "He is," Willa agreed, "and we raised him right. He is going to be a good husband." James and Anna built a house on the far edge of the ranch property, and within a year they had made Graham and Willa grandparents. The baby, a boy they named Thomas, was the light of everyone's life. Graham was utterly besotted with his grandson, spending hours rocking him and singing to him and telling him stories about the ranch. Rose, meanwhile, had finished her own schooling and officially taken over some of Willa's teaching duties. She was 18 now, beautiful and brilliant and independent, and she showed no interest in settling down. She had dreams of going to the new teachers' college in Spokane, of getting a real education so she could open a proper school. Graham and Willa supported her ambitions, proud of their daughter's determination to make something of herself. On a cold evening in January of 1896, 18 years after Graham had found Willa in the snow, they sat together in front of the fire in their home. Rose was in Spokane at the college. James and Anna were in their own house with Thomas, now a rambunctious 2-year-old. For the first time in years, it was just the two of them, the way it had been in the beginning. "It is quiet without Rose here," Willa said, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "Too quiet," Graham agreed. "I miss her already, and she has only been gone a week. She will do well at the college. She is smarter than I ever was." Graham reached over and stilled her hands, making her look at him. "She is smart because you are smart and because you taught her the value of learning. Do not sell yourself short, Willa Stone. You have done more with your life than most people could ever dream of." Willa set down her knitting and moved to sit beside Graham on the settee, curling into his side the way she had done 1,000 times before. "I have had a good life, better than I ever imagined possible." "We have had a good life," Graham corrected. "And we are going to have many more years together. I plan to be around to see our grandchildren grow up, and maybe even great-grandchildren if we are lucky." "That sounds perfect." They sat there together as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, warm and safe and deeply in love. They had built something remarkable together, a family and a home and a legacy that would outlast them both. And it had all started with a desperate woman running through a blizzard and a cowboy who had been kind enough to stop. As the years moved toward the turn of the century, the ranch continued to thrive under the combined efforts of Graham and James. They had expanded to over 400 acres now, running 300 head of cattle and breeding some of the finest horses in the region. The house had been updated and improved, with proper glass windows and a wood floor in every room. They even had a telephone installed in 1898, connecting them to Wallace and the wider world in a way that still seemed miraculous. Rose returned from college with her teaching certificate and promptly opened a school in Wallace, teaching 30 students in a building the town had built specifically for that purpose. She was engaged now to a young lawyer named Matthew who had come west from Boston, and they planned to marry in the spring. Willa and Graham approved of the match, seeing in Matthew the same kind of intelligence and kindness that Rose herself possessed. Thomas had a younger brother now, Samuel, and James and Anna were talking about possibly having a third child. Graham and Willa loved being grandparents, relishing the chance to spoil the children and then send them home to their parents at the end of the day. Willa had started updating her journal with stories about the grandchildren, wanting them to know someday about the family they came from and the love that had created it all. On March 7th, 1900, Graham and Willa celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary. They had a family dinner at the main house, with James and Anna and the boys, Rose and Matthew, Pete, who was now in his 70s but still spry, and Clara and her family who had made the trip from Spokane. After the meal, after the toasts and the laughter and the stories, Graham stood and cleared his throat. "I want to say something," he announced, and the room fell quiet. 22 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I have ever known. She came to me with nothing but courage and determination, and she has spent every day since then making my life better in ways I cannot even count. Willa, you are my heart and my home. You are the reason I get up every morning and the reason I sleep peacefully every night. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for building this life with me. There was not a dry eye in the room by the time he finished. Willa stood and crossed to her husband, wrapping her arms around him and holding him tight. I love you, she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Thank you for saving my life and then making it worth living. They stood there together, surrounded by their family, surrounded by the life they had built from such difficult beginnings. And as Willa looked around the room at her children and grandchildren, at the home she and Graham had created, she felt nothing but gratitude. The blizzard that had nearly killed her had instead brought her to Graham, and Graham had given her everything she had ever wanted but never dared to hope for: a home, a family, safety, respect, and most of all, love. Deep, abiding, unconditional love that had sustained them through hardships and celebrated them through joys. As the party continued around them, Willa and Graham slipped out onto the porch, stealing a quiet moment alone under the stars. The March air was cold but not bitterly so, carrying the promise of spring. In a few weeks the meadows would be green with new growth, and the cycle of life on the ranch would begin again. "Happy anniversary," Graham said, pulling her close. "Happy anniversary," Willa replied, resting her head on his shoulder. They stood there together, just as they had stood together through everything else, partners in the truest sense of the word. And as the laughter and voices of their family drifted out through the windows behind them, Willa knew with absolute certainty that she had been right all those years ago when she walked into a blizzard. Sometimes running toward uncertainty was better than staying in a place where you could not survive. Sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply putting one foot in front of the other and trusting that something better waited on the other side of the storm. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, what waited for you was a cowboy with gray eyes and a kind heart, who would not only save your life but spend the rest of his showing you what it meant to truly live.